Okay, we were talking about realism, this movement in the middle of the 19th century that began, around in 1848. In many ways, a response to the Third Revolution, right, in France, which focused a lot of energy from the government on the working poor in France, trying to better the situation of particularly some of the people that were, behind the revolution of 1848. The disenfranchised, right? The people who'd worked all their lives and not been able to get ahead. Our stonebreakers from Courbet, right? And this began the realist movement. Manet is and what realist is real images of real things, real people, right? And what they mean by real is everyday, right? They mean no mythological pictures, no great history pictures from ancient Rome, no biblical images, no mythological pictures, right? Scenes of everyday life, but different than the Dutch had been doing, where there are these sort of broader morals about behavior, about, weighing your pearls and whatnot, right? Not that sort of thing, but really more sort of socially engaged messages about those in society who are not being served as well. That's how it started, right? When we get to the 1860s with Manet, we have still an interest in modern contemporary life, right? Scenes of the current day, everyday ordinary events, no newsworthy events, right? No Raft of the Medusa, where it's so newsworthy that you covered it as news, right? These are just everyday occurrences. A prostitute in her boudoir, right? A group of 4 people out having a rather raunchy little picnic, Just everyday life, nothing special. I guess there is something special. I've never had that picnic, but there's nothing ostensibly special or newsworthy about it, right? And for Manet, it's life in the city, and it's not necessarily the downtrodden, although one would argue that prostitutes, don't necessarily have it all that good in life. But our people at the left are just sort of a couple dandy guys, talking philosophy with the women around them. Right? So this is part of this realist movement. And we're going to see how important this is, because with realism, we'll bleed over into other movements that become very interested in trying to capture contemporary French society and trying to make an art that reflects the modern world, and does this not only with its choice of subject matter, but with the way that they paint as being different from the way people painted before. Right? If you're going to try and make a work of art that reflects the modern world, why should you use the same tired stylistic conventions that people had used going all the way back to the Renaissance, going all the way back to the 1400s, right? This is now 450 years later. Why should we worry about Brunelleschi and perspective anymore, right? Why should we worry about models who are based on ancient Roman prototypes? These kind of traditions have dominated art up to this point. And they're saying, we want to make art about the modern world. We want to make a modern style as well. And Manet is a perfect example of that. Not only is the subject matter modern, but we talked about the way he painted being particularly modern, right? That this open, unblended brushwork, which he learned from looking at some Baroque artists that we talked about last class, right? But it's not particularly traditional. It's not the norm. It's not what the Royal Academy was teaching. Right? So he's finding a new style for new art, a new style for his new scenes of the new world, and then modern. And this gets him in trouble, as we talked about at the very end of class. He gets his works rejected from the Salon. Both of these were painted the same year. Both have the same model. The one on the left was submitted to the Salon of 1863. It's a rather large picture, right? Figures are about half-life size. It's a little bit bigger than we see it on the screen here. It's a pretty big picture, right? And it's rejected from the Salon of 1863. The one on the right was submitted to the next Salon. These are sponsored by the Royal Academy in 1865. They accept it, but it's ridiculed viciously in the press, right? As a result of the Salon of 1863 and the number of works that were rejected, there was a call to say that the Royal Academy didn't know what they were doing. Right? They questioned their authority. And the Royal Academy set up a salon of the refused work. Right? The salon of the rejected work. The Salon des Refusés. Of the something like 2,500 works that were refused that year. And so Manet's work got seen. Right? And that's probably why they accepted the Olympia 2 years later, because they didn't want a repeat of the scandal around that wholesale rejection of modern art, right? And the point of the rejection, I'll get in a second, Jason, the point of the rejection is that they didn't like the way that Manet was painting. They felt that he was making fun of them. He was making fun of the Royal Academy, not only through the way he paints, but the subject matter, the references back to Titian and Raphael, right? All of the goofing off with perspective, right? All of these things they felt was sort of poking them in the eye. And they rejected him for that, right? Along with a bunch of other works. Okay, we'll come back to that. Jason.
So who made was that a real thing? The Salon de Refuse?
Yeah, okay, so what happened, going back, and you get it the first time around of the recording from a week ago, right, from Monday last. We talked about this. But the Royal Academy sponsors a biennial show of works of art from its members. And in order really to be a practicing artist in France, you had to be a member of the Royal Academy. It was originally established back in Louis XIV's time, back in the 17th century, right? And we've talked about it from time to time. We've talked about the Rubinists and the Poussinists in the Royal Academy, sort of setting up classical art in the 17th century and Rococo in the 18th century, right? We talked about Ingres winning the Rome Prize. That was given by the Royal Academy as well as part of what the Salon did to reward young artists. So we've seen this sort of crop up many times through history. And by the middle of the 19th century, they have a significant amount of control over what art is going to look like in France, okay? So every year there's a salon. And it's named after one of the rooms in the Louvre, right? The Salon Carré, the square room. And they do this every other year. There's a salon that's juried, okay? So members of the Royal Academy sit on the jury, and when artists come and submit their works, they say, I want Madison's, but I don't want Alyssa's, right? And it's normal for them to reject some. That's the whole point of having a jury, right? To edit, if you will, the works, as these are not as good as these, right? And in 1863, there's something like 5,000 works, give or take, that were submitted to the Salon of 1863, and they rejected almost half of them, right? And there was a public outcry on the part of the artists to the Royal Salon, right? I mean, so to the Royal Academy saying, you guys are being too strict. You're not up to date with what's going on in art today. We're doing things that are important and they need to be seen, and you guys are sort of functioning in the last century, right? They're out of date. So what happened is, to appease the outcry, Jason, now this is the long answer to your question, right? To appease the outcry, the Royal Academy itself set up this second show of the rejected works, not in the same gallery, right? In a different gallery across town. And what turned out to happen was it actually became more popular. Because everybody's like, what's that? We got to go see this stuff. It's got to be really crazy, right? It's got to be really, really bad. And everybody wants to go see something really bad, right? Almost as much as they want to see something really good, right? When something is that bad, you've got to go see it. And so they did, and everybody talked about the Manet, right? That was the center of the storm. And people were apparently like shocked and fainting. You know, it's hard to believe now, but that was the reaction, right? The other thing that's hard to get now is this idea of how important this biennial show was to the community. And by the community, I mean all of Paris, if not wider. Hundreds of thousands, it's only up for like 3 or 4 weeks, right? And hundreds of thousands of people show up to see the Salon, right? So it's a big thing. And in an era without other kinds of entertainment, right? No TV, no Netflix, right? No radio. Certainly there are other kinds of entertainment. You know, you can go to see the Can-Can show, right? On the Montmartre, you can go see the Moulin Rouge, right? There's that kind of entertainment, or go see Olympia, for an intimate evening out out, right? But we're so surrounded by entertainment, we don't have to look for it, right? This was huge. So the huge part of the Salon of the Refused Works is it led to really a very important issue for the development of art from this point forward, after 1863, which is the questioning of authority. That's a huge tradition for what becomes modern art. Why should we make art that looks like what we're being told by the old guys it's supposed to look like? Why can't we break the rules? Right? Especially if we want to make an art that addresses the concerns of contemporary society. If that's what they're really striving for, then they don't want to use a tired, worn-out style of art to reflect a modern society. They want to use something that's new, fresh, different. Right? And so with Manet, who really didn't want to break down the authority of the Academy, he really ended up doing that, right? Or at least helping do that because of what happened in 1863, right? And he's not the only artist that's being rejected by the Salon. And Manet is rejected a lot, right? He really wants to be accepted. He really believes in what he's doing. And he wants the Royal Academy to come around to his way of thinking. But his works get rejected regularly in the 1860s. Right? Quite a few of them get rejected over the course of the decade. And he's not alone, right? Any artist who's trying to depict contemporary scenes, because the Royal Academy still likes historical things, right? The Royal Academy still likes good old Roman mythologies and biblical pictures and beautiful, refined brushwork, right? That's polished and shows mastery of the medium. Other artists who are being rejected decide to get together and form their own group. So this is why this is so important, right? The question of the Royal Academy in 1863. A group of artists who had been rejected regularly in the 1860s got together in 1873, right? And they formed a society of independent artists, right? Actually, they call themselves artist painters, right? In French. The Society of Independent Artists in fall of 1873. And at the center of the group is Monet, Claude Monet. And he gathers around him about 30 artists who are really sick and tired of the Royal Academy, sick and tired of getting their works rejected. And they're going to now try to function independent from the Academy because ever since 1863, that's now a possibility. Whereas prior to 1863, that was simply impossible to even think about that, right? Manet knocked the doors down, right? Or helped knock the doors down, even if it's not what he wanted to do. And they set up their own show, right? They circumvent the jury at the Royal Academy, and to stick it to them a bit further, they opened their exhibition 2 weeks before the Royal Academy Salon of 1874, right? Remember, it comes up every 2 years, right? There's a Salon in 1874. It's interrupted, the timing gets interrupted certain years because of war, right? 1874, there's a Salon in April. This group, the Society of Independent Artists, opens their their show 2 weeks in advance of that. And there's two reasons why. One is just like, heck with you guys, we're out of here, right? But the other one is they can then say, we did this not because we were rejected, but because we don't care, right? If they'd done it after the Royal Academy show, there might be this thing, you guys are just putting something together because you couldn't get in. This says more adamantly, we don't even want to get in, right? We're done. Talk to the hand, right? So the Society of Independent Artists gathers together in 1873. They then have their first show in early 1874, just in advance of the annual Royal Academy Salon, right? As a protest of sorts. And there are roughly 30 of them, right? Each one has anywhere between 1 and 4 works in the show, right? The show gets middling reviews. Some of them are very positive. Some of them quite like what they're doing. Some of them are negative because it's pretty radical compared to what art was looking like at the time, compared to even Manet. They're more radically underdeveloped, if you will, underpolished as an art style. We'll look at some details so we can see that. And there was a review of the show that seized on this picture by Monet, The Impressionist Sunrise, that said basically that there are no finished works here whatsoever. Everything seems as if it was just an impression, right? Using that title that Monet had in fact used. That everything looks like an impression, and it led to them being thus called the Impressionists, right? So the term Impressionism, which we now adore, right, began as a negative criticism of the show, right? As a way of saying there's nothing here thoughtful, right? You know the old adage, right? You don't trust your first impressions. Is that because impressions, are not really thought through? And when the critic talks about these as being impressionist, he's saying that these aren't thoughtful pictures. These are not important pictures. Of course, we know now that that is anything but. Right? Now, some things about Impressionism that are worthwhile sort of going over. I got four major points, right? One, it's directly linked to realism. All of the Impressionist artists kind of thought of themselves as realists, right? It's very directly linked to it. So in Monet's case here, it's a scene of contemporary life, right? In Impressionist Sunrise. It's a harbor. It's in fact the city where he grew up. It's where the river Seine empties into the North Sea, right? It's Le Havre, if you care. I don't that much. I don't care. I don't care that you don't. You know it or not, I should say. I do care. And it's an industrialized harbor. And you can see that at the beginning of the morning, we're looking through the industrial haze. We see smokestacks in the distance. We can see the industrial ships with the cranes that load them through the haze. And in the foreground, we see a couple of boats with fishermen going out for their morning catch, right? Just at sunrise. And it's certainly perhaps a nostalgic scene of old versus new, right? Old ways with the fishermen and their dories, new ways with the industrial shipping harbor in the background, right? There's nothing particularly attractive about it as a scene. He's looking unflinchingly at the modern world, quite like Manet in his way, looking at modern industry and giving us a sort of unflinching view of that. So, again, directly linked to realism. That's sort of our first point to sort of assert with the Impressionists, right? Another of these scenes of the modern world, one of my favorite pictures from the National Gallery. These early Monets, I think, are fantastic. So this is after the first Impressionist show, right? And we'll I want to make sure I haven't lost my notes here. We'll come to that, right? Where Monet, we see through a lot of his work that he's very much interested in water. We'll talk more about that. Water and reflections are for him a very important motif. But in this case, again, it's a scene of the modern world. That's a brand new bridge. Right? We look at highway bridges. It looks like the one in Georgetown, kind of, doesn't it? Right? We look at highway bridges. We don't think twice about them. Right? But a bridge spanning the Seine River. Right? This is a suburb of Paris, Argenteuil, on the Seine River. And a bridge spanning the Seine was a brand new construction. Right? This was part of the construction, I think, that went on after the Franco-Prussian War that we talked about. Right? That destroyed part of Paris. There was a huge rebuilding in France. Right? The sort of thing that the French would be very, very proud of at this time, modern industry, right? Argenteuil was a popular weekend destination for people from Paris. There was a railroad bridge as well that could get to Paris very easily now. Prior to the advent of railways, right? It was much more difficult to get out here. These days it's difficult to get out there because there's always a traffic jam. And I decided, I looked at pictures online, I was going to go because I drove right through Argenteuil summer before last, right? And I thought I should stop, I should see. And I looked at the online pictures, it's just apparently it's a horrible industrial suburb now, right? And traffic is always backed up like 270, right? On a rainy night, but all the time. Well, anyway, in the 19th century, it was this popular weekend destination. You get away from the city. And there were a lot of sailing docks there, right? It was a place you would go just put the boat in the water for the weekend. And Monet captures that leisure, right? And we've seen, even with Manet, that the idea of leisure has crept into the whole realist idea because it's part of modern life, right? Modern leisure alongside modern labor. It's really those early things that are focused on labor, right? His attitude toward industry is up for grabs. People read it both ways, but if we look at the people on top of the bridge using it as a platform to get a better view up and down the river, it seems like there's a kind of a positive spin on this, right? That the river itself, with its sightseers, suggests that this is not viewed by Monet as an encroachment of evil industry into the pristine countryside. They've dropped that romantic idea that we saw with Thomas Cole, right? When we looked at American landscape painting, or Caspar David Friedrich, or Constable in England, right? We've sort of dropped that in lieu of sort of an embrace of the modern world. And that makes sense, because realism is really about the modern world, aspects of the modern world, right? So it makes sense that he would be interested in something more positive. Okay, so that's first thing, right? It's deeply indebted to realism, okay? The second thing, despite what you may read on almost any website anywhere, Manet was not an impressionist. Okay? He was friends with Monet. He was friends with all of the Impressionists, or a huge group of them. In fact, he came from a very well-heeled background. He had a lot of money, and he often bought drinks for these poor artists because he had family money to spend, right? Well, they liked him for that, right? Buy drinks, hang out with them, and had nothing against them, but he never joined the group. The Impressionists were a distinct group, right? They invited him to join this Society of Independent Artists because he was being rejected all the time. Come with us, Brother Eddie, right? We're gonna figure out a way to get our works out there and be seen. But Manet wanted the Royal Academy to come to him. He wanted to change their minds, and he was adamant that if he's going to make it as an artist, he's going to make it in the Royal Academy. So they asked him in 1873, please join our group. He said no. Right? He denied membership. Right? He denied himself membership in the group. And the interesting thing about the railway that we have at the National Gallery is, in fact, remember we talked about the fact that the Impressionist show went up 2 weeks before the Royal Academy Salon, right, of 1874. Guess what painting was in the Royal Academy Salon of 1874? Manet's Railway, right? So this is a painting that seems Impressionist in a lot of different ways. When we talk about Impressionists, Manet seems like one in his approach to painting, but this is the work that he showed with the Royal Academy that he could have showed with the Impressionists, but he chose not to, right? So Manet is not an impressionist. Third thing, when we think of Impressionism, we think of Monet, right? We sort of think of these bright sunlit scenes of late 19th century Paris with paint that's super bright, often unmixed, but placed next to each other on the canvas so that your eye mixes them as you move away, leaving the brushwork entirely unblended, extraordinarily colorful, very little in the way of actual black paint anywhere to be found. Even the darkest shadows of the fir trees behind the gatehouse on the bridge are a very dark forest green. Sort of a general avoidance of black, right? Because color is everywhere. That's what we usually think of when we think of Impressionism. But there are 30 different artists, and the glue that holds the group together is that they're rebels, that they don't like the Royal Academy, that they want to be independent from the jury. That's the only glue that holds them together. They want to be independent from the jury at the Royal Academy. It is not the style of the group that holds them together. Because remember, Impressionism was a title that was foisted on them, right? That they sort of adopted later, right? So if we think of Impressionism and the Impressionists, we should keep in the back of our minds that Impressionism is a group identity, right? It's group membership, rather than painting like Monet, rather than a shared style. right? Now, there were 8 Impressionist shows, so that's another way that we can think about this group membership. It is a group membership in a very defined time frame. 8 shows over the course of 12 years, right? The first one, 1874, second one, 1875, third one, 1877. I can't recite them all, right? So anything before 1874, we really shouldn't be calling Impressionism yet, even if there are people like Monet who become part of the group. The Impressionists are this group of 30 artists, give or take, that mount these 8 shows over 12 years. Okay? Monet is the most well-known of all of them, right? So it is a group identity. It is a group membership that defines it. It's worth saying that nobody was in all 8 shows. Monet was only in 5 of them, so just over half, right? Just under half of the Impressionist shows didn't even have a Monet in them, right? And there are other artists working in alternative styles that all they really want is to be independent from the salon, okay? So just keep in mind as we think about the term that there's more to it than just the style that we think of when we think of Monet, okay? Now, what else do they share other than group identity? A new way of painting, right? Not necessarily the style, but the technique. They're painting outside for the very first time.
Is that in plein air?
Yeah, in plein air, right? So all it means is in the out of doors, right? En plein air, in the out of doors, in full sunlight, right? So unlike any other artist that we've seen so far, right? Whether it's Constable with the Haywain, whether it's back in the 17th century with Jacob van Ruisdael and those Dutch landscapes that look so realistic, none of them were painting outside. They were painting back in the studio. They would go outside and make sketches with pen and ink, right? But then they would come back in the studio and compose their landscapes. Remember when we looked at that wonderful Niagara Falls picture by Frederick Church? That's in there. That's huge, right? Like 8 feet across. And it's so realistic. But he's painting it entirely in the studio, regardless of that realism. He's creating that from studies, right? The Impressionists are going outside. Why? Because they want to capture that light. They want to capture that color. They want the canvas to reflect how it looked at a particular moment. This is why Monet first uses the word impression, right? It says, boom, it's a visual stimulus, right? It's not an analysis. It's an attempt to objectively capture what they're seeing outside. And that's something you simply can't do in the studio, even if you're looking through a window, right? So they are taking and they're setting their canvases up on easels in the landscape, in the out of doors, en plein air, right? They're painting outside. And this is why most Impressionist pictures tend to be smaller, right? Because obviously you're not going to haul around a 7-foot canvas with you when you're doing it outside. Monet tries to do one in his garden. It's going to be 10 feet tall, and he can't figure out how to paint the top, so he digs a ditch, and he has a pulley, so he lower it down so he can paint things that he was seeing, and then raise it back up so he can paint the bottom, right? Painting out. Now, why did they decide to paint outside? Not only is they motivated by trying to capture color that they see around them, but there's a technological, or I don't know if technological is the right word, a technical development. You know how we're used to paint coming in those little metal tubes that you squeeze, like toothpaste tubes, right? You squeeze it out. It didn't exist before 1840. Those are first invented in 1840. Prior to 1840, if you were an artist painting in a studio, you'd have the kid you're training would grind up the dry pigment and mix it into the oil, or before that into the egg yolk, right? And you would pretty much mix up what you thought you could use for the day. And if you had anything left over, you might put it in a little piece of gut, right? Cow gut or something like that, right? Make a little sack out of it that you could use later. But if that's how you're making your paint, there's no way you're going outside to paint because it's just not practical, right? They're not going to keep. They're going to fall out of these little makeshift entrail tubes that you've made, right? But with these rolled up metal tubes of paint, you could go out with 100 different colors, right? Mix them on a palette right there. and they're going to stay fluid. They're going to not skin over, right? They're going to stay pristine. And with that technology came artists going off and starting to paint outside, right? And the Impressionists, that facilitated it. Without that, there wouldn't have been Impressionism, right? They would not have had this. So what binds them together? Membership in this group over these 12 years, showing at these 8 different shows, and painting out of doors. Almost all of them paint directly in front of the scenes that they're painting, right? But like I said, Monet is the guy we most associate with this. Now, it appears very spontaneous. If we keep in the back of our mind that Impressionism is painted outside with the attempt to capture effects of light, right? The work itself has a sort of spontaneous look about it, because he's not spending time blending the brushstrokes between the blues and the white. Everything sort of flickers, and it still looks today as if it almost looks wet, right? And you can see parts where even the canvas still sort of shows through, that it hasn't painted every square inch of it. You can see places where the canvas is, the weave of the canvas is more easy to see, and other places where the paint is thicker, but it looks as if it's sort of fleeting. But it's anything but. Because the painters would work outside, but they would usually complete the work back in the studio. So they're setting up easel, they're setting up canvas, and they'll start to get it. And let's just say this day in Argenteuil that Monet is capturing here at the National Gallery. What do you do if you're painting this and all of a sudden, gray clouds come? What Monet would do is he'd take his canvas, put it over here, put another one up, and get started again. Right? On now Argenteuil, a cloudy day. Right? And capture that as well. And then take these starts that he's worked on outside and bring them back into the studio and complete them there. How do we know this? Paint layers. Oil paint takes forever to dry. You cannot paint over the top of it without smudging it, smearing it, and having it blend together. Monet has wet paint over dry paint on numerous places in his pictures. So we know that they weren't done in one sitting outside, which is the myth about Impressionism. Right? It's long-term. And even in this detail, look at how carefully he's lining up some of his strokes to be over the top of each other, to accent the edges of other brush strokes. Right? That is, Impressionism looks spontaneous. It looks easy. It looks sketchy. But it's exactly the opposite. It's built up over hours and hours of work, and usually multiple programs of work. Right? Now, this whole spontaneity is, again, to get it to look... one of the themes of the pictures for Impressionism, what separates Impressionism from realism? They're both interested in modern life, but for the Impressionists, the subject matter of the painting, the road bridge at Argenteuil. But you could arguably call it sailboats at Argenteuil if you wanted to, right? I don't know what Monet actually called it. I think he called it the road bridge. The subject matter is this realist subject matter of modern Paris. But at the same time, the theme of the picture is also light, the effects of light. And this is why Monet chooses to live in this suburb of Argenteuil. This is why he chooses images of water so often, is he likes changing patterns of light. And so the theme of this picture is sort of twofold. On the one hand, it's the road bridge at Argenteuil, but on the other hand, it's the road bridges at Argenteuil as a receptor of these flickering colors. And so if we look at the detail on the right, you can see the way he's painted the gray stone bridge is to bring hundreds of different colors into it as they reflect off the water and hit the bridge. And the spontaneous paint application amplifies this idea that what Monet is really painting is light. Like he doesn't care that he's painting the bridge as much as he cares that he's painting the effects of light. And this is part of the reason that Monet and most of the Impressionists work in series. They'll do multiple pictures of exactly the same subject, with the idea that each one of them what you'll see when you look at them in series, right? And Monet would give 7 images of the same scene to one of these shows, right? You look at them side by side by side by side, and what you see is different times of day, different points of view, different compositions from the exact same view. So this is, I think we're at the far end looking this way. We're looking to our left, because there you can see that roadhouse, right? The gatehouse there, one of them, and we're sort of looking, so we're standing sort of on the other side of the bridge here looking through this way, right? But when you see them side by side, and sometimes it's almost exactly the same composition, what you end up focusing on, seeing them all together, is what makes them different, which is the light on that day versus that day, on that hour versus that hour, rather than the road bridge itself, right? So this is down in Richmond, another view of this, and the National Gallery has a third one, right? And again, the cumulative effect becomes these different times of year, the different effects of light and weather and atmosphere on the different pictures, and that's almost what he's more interested in, or equally as interested in, as the road bridge itself, right? So Monet is the sort of the titular impressionist, but remember that that's not kind of the wrong way to think about impressionism, right? There are these artists working in multiple different styles at the same time, many of them in the somewhat similar style, but not all of them. So we're going to look at a couple of the other impressionists here. We'll look at 4 or 5 of them. Camille Pissarro was one of the founding members in 1873, and I think that this was in the very first Impressionist show in 1874, right? He was also somewhat the old man of the group. By this time he's in his 50s, I think. And in fact, not that Monet, by the way, is all that young at this point, but Pissarro's probably a good 10 years older than he is. And became, we'll find out, the mentor to a number of other painters, teaching them sort of how to paint outside. The importance of direct observation and painting in the out-of-doors. Pissarro is one of the great champions of that idea. And as we look at his painting more closely, the basic style is similar to Monet's. Unblended brush work, right, that optically blends together from a distance, that appears to be spontaneous and unblended, but in fact is anything but. If you look at the row of orange haystacks, and between number 3 and 4, and before and 5, you can see these horizontal strokes in kind of an arc, right, just here, here. And you'll notice that the haystacks are painted over the top of that, right? That means that this is dry when he paints that, right? Because he couldn't paint it this way without disturbing those strokes that continue to run underneath it, right? This indicates for us that he's working this up over time. And the more you look at the rest of it, the more you realize that some of those greens down below are painted over the top of the yellows after it's gone dry, right? He's come back and touched it up on numerous occasions. So still very much like Monet, trying to capture, I think, the appearance of atmosphere at this particular time of day. The Ile-de-France, if you don't know, is the area around Paris, right? They call it the island of France. It's the area immediately around Paris. And to this day, it's referred to as that. So this is the outskirts of Paris, right? Beyond the suburbs, a little bit further out than even Monet is. For Pissarro, even though as an impressionist, working in league, if you will, with Monet, with Pissarro, the subject matter is extraordinarily important. He belonged to a progressive political party that believed that industry was not having a good effect on the modern world. And Pissarro, in his early years, paints primarily these images of idyllic rural life, farmers in the fields, in tune with nature, in a way that he felt himself to be out of tune back in Paris. In fact, he too moves to another of the suburbs around Paris in order to have easy access to this. So what we have are these farmers in the fields. There aren't that many of them, right? There's a fellow on top of the hay wain, the hay cart in the back. These two figures in the foreground, again, notice how sketchy the paint application is, right? Almost nothing there whatsoever. But there's no sense in looking at all of the work that's been done that it was all that difficult. Nobody seems downtrodden. Nobody seems bent and stooped by this work. There's no sign, like what we saw with Millet, of them working for anyone else's profit than their own. There's a sense of plenty to feed them, right? The working in harmony with nature will give you a good life. And we know from Pissarro's political writings that this is, in fact, was the party platform of the group that he belonged to, was this idea that there is plenty out there to feed everyone, that rural life is a moral alternative to life in the city. Right? Do we still have that? Kinda, when we talk about, middle America, the flyover zones, we talk about the sort of the roots of American identity being wrapped up with that. Why do we go camping? Is there something about that that's worthwhile sort of getting into? And a number of Pissarro's works in the 1870s take up this theme of rural labor, but not showing it as being something problematic, right? Not showing it as being something difficult, right? These orchards, right? We're gathering the sticks as we're pruning the orchards. But again, people don't look as if this is your Courbet stonebreakers or your gleaners from Millet. It doesn't have that sense of being traumatic, right? Onerous, difficult. And this is because of his outlook, right? Focuses on work, but it's not that bad, right? Almost recreational in its way. Now, other Impressionists worked in drastically alternative subject matters, and to a certain degree, alternative styles. Edgar Degas was another founding member of the group, right? So this work from 1873 may well have been in the original Impressionist show. The timing is right for it, and it's a large picture, so I think, it might have been. I'd have to do some research to find that out. But it shows the range of Impressionism, right? They're not just a bunch of people painting outside, these rural scenes with clouds flitting through the sky, right? And broken brushwork that blends to give the sense of sunlight dappling on different things in the great outdoors. He paints a significant number of images of ballet, one of 2 or 3 themes that he paints regularly and repeatedly, ballet dancers. He also does a series of horse racers, whole series of prostitutes in their boudoir. We'll see 1 or 2 of those as well, right? So Degas, another founding member, not really interested much at all in landscape painting. There are none of the sort of pure landscapes we see with Pissarro or Monet in his work, focuses on people in the city. And he said that he hated the term Impressionism. Said that there's nothing impressionistic about my work at all. In other words, if you think about the term impression and what it means, right, a fleeting sort of visual, I get it, right? That's not at all his work. He says he says if you want to put a label on me, I'm a realist painter, right? And that only goes to show what I mentioned earlier in class, is that Impressionism is an outgrowth of the realist movement. He said there's nothing impressionist about my work, meaning that it's thoughtful, it's deliberate, right? It's time-consuming. Right? It's the result of long and hard work. Right? It's not impressionist, even though he was a member of that group and exhibited with them regularly. Right? He would take almost exactly the same composition and redo it on multiple occasions, which to a certain degree betrays the idea that these are simple observations, right? It shows the degree to which he reworks things back in the studio. So this is almost exactly the same composition, right? We have what appears to be almost the same place in the dance studio with the the spiral staircase coming down from the left, even with the feet sort of coming down the stairs, that blocking the view of some of the ballerinas behind it. But then if we look at the back wall, you'll notice that in the picture on the left, which is in Scotland, there are more windows and more walls in between them. Whereas in the one on the right, there are fewer of them. And it may just be that he's shifted his view, but he's moving things around on the canvas. Right? There's that open alcove behind, but we don't see as much of it. Right? He's really working these things up back in the studio as much as he's working on location with these. Right? Now, is he an impressionist for other reasons than group membership? Certainly. There's this broken brushwork we've seen, right? This really flashy, sketchy brushwork. But that's not enough, is it? Manet had that as well, but never joined the group. Still, when we look at Degas close up, we can see that at a certain point, the closer we get, the more what appears to be three-dimensional forms breaks down into just paint. Right? That wonderful red robe with the yellow ribbon. At a certain point, when you're close enough, it's just yellow paint. Or the pink ribbon of the girl bending over in front of us. Degas is an interesting character. There's a whole body of literature out there about whether or not he's misogynist. Because he likes women in awkward positions. There's one bending over in front of us here, right? He's not capturing ballerinas and what we would, it's not your Misty Copeland sort of stuff, right? Modeling for perfume companies or clothing companies, right? These are ungainly poses that suggest like he's seeing things that people don't want him to see. And I'm always been kind of fascinated with this because all of Degas' pictures, whether they are dancers or bathers, he likes performers behind the scenes. That's one of his favorite themes, is this sort of privileged view of a performer behind the scenes. He doesn't have anywhere near as many pictures. In fact, very, very few pictures of ballerinas on stage. But ballerinas practicing up the wazoo, right? Right, left, and center. So, like other impressionists, he makes it look spontaneous, right? But it isn't, right? And the fact that he repeats these compositions suggests to us that it's not as spontaneous as all that. He has other effects he uses to make it appear spontaneous as well. Degas is the champion of strange cropping effects, right? Where things are cut off by the frame that suggests a sort of momentary view. You know how when you've got your camera out and you got to take a selfie, as much as I hate selfies, right? But you got to take a selfie. You're going to make sure you're in the middle of the picture, right? And you're not going to get just one eyeball, right? Or an ear or something like that sticking. Okay, you've got to take it again, right? Get everybody, or if you're not taking a selfie, taking a picture of your friends. Okay, move in from the right, you're not in the picture, right? Well, Degas, when he frames pictures, cuts things off all the time, right? Whether it's the staircase on the left with the legs coming down, or the figures on the right-hand border, right, of this picture also being cut off. Or the dancers behind the staircase. Those are really fantastic. The way it's been blocked, right? If the view of this is the dance class and what's happening in the dance class, then look at these. I love that leg that's coming out from the side, right here, right? That's just, who is she? Where is she? Where's the rest of her body? How does that? Well, she's back here. She's got one leg up. But where is this girl compared to this one down here? It's just all these things that are kind of cut off, right? And that gives it the sense of not being staged, right? Of not being consciously arranged, of being caught off guard. Now, cameras were invented, right, back in the 1820s, 1830s. But the early cameras had really long exposures, right? They had a really, really small aperture that made it in focus, right? And that meant they had to have the shutter open for a really long time. And so most photos you see are of things that don't move, right? So this is why all the Civil War photos are dead men, right? Or soldiers just standing up like this. But they're never like battle because it was a 4-second exposure, right? And people who had their portraits photoed had to have like a brace behind their head, to keep them still, right? But by the 1870s, camera technology had begun to improve, and they actually were handheld cameras, right? Little brownies. Degas had one, right? He would take a lot of photographs, right? And a lot of artists were working from photographs. And what they were doing when they're going outside with these things is they're beginning to take sort of snapshots. And that idea of getting things that might be moving in and out of the picture as you're setting it up, it comes into the way he composes pictures as well, right? That it has a certain spontaneity to its arrangement of forms, right? There's another influence on this, not just the camera, right? He's looking a lot at Japanese art. These prints, woodblock prints from Japan, had started to filter their way into France as early as the 1850s or so. And in fact, there was a major exhibition of Japanese art in Paris in the 1850s, and artists became really interested in non-Western art, beginning with Japan, and later on we'll see they become interested in Indonesian art, in African art, in primitive art. And for Degas, in looking at things like Hiroshige, which he could pick up for a song at the time, right? This 18th century or 19th century Japanese printmaker. One of the things that Degas loves about them is the way in which Hiroshige has these strange blocking effects, where sort of a flat form will form a frame that you have to look around and through to see what's going on behind it. And Degas does exactly the same thing with his spiral staircase, right? It almost as if he teases us. I want to show you this stuff, but I'm not gonna, right? And Hiroshige as well, there's some of the people on the harbor, right, are blocked by it. And then as we see it move back into space, we have a lot of this open space as we move back into the distance in the landscape, sort of a flat open space for the water, right? That doesn't look as if it looks like it goes back into space, but at the same time it's one flat color on the surface. And we look at Degas' floor, and we sort of see the same thing, right? This one flat color of brown, but also then gives us a tension between being the surface of the canvas and going back into space. And that's something he's getting from looking at Hiroshige, right? I got another one to show you. I love these things. I wish we had more time to spend with them, right? These amazing sort of views through things, right? And these flat areas of tone that sit on the surface of the work of art that have but then also look as if they go back into it, right? And Degas has been looking at this. So at the beginning of class today, right, we were talking about how, when we looked at Manet at the very beginning of class, we talked about how with the realists, they're trying to make a modern art for the modern world, right? That's what realism is all about, a modern art for the modern world. To reflect on a certain level how the modern world is drastically different from what had come before, right? From previous generations, previous centuries. And part of Manet's use of broken brushwork was to make an art in a way that violated centuries of tradition, right? Well, this interest in non-Western art was another way of sort of finding a way out. You're sort of crippled by the inheritance of Raphael, the inheritance of Rubens, right, the way art was supposed to be made. And they're looking for a new way to do it. And Impressionism, right, broken brushwork of Manet is one way to get there. Asian art, right, Japanese art became another way to say there's a different way to make pictures. Right? And if we can inject some of that style into this, we can break the stranglehold of the academy. Right? So Degas' interest here is really very much motivated by trying to make works of art that are modern in every possible way, not only in subject matter, but in a non-traditional approach to making pictures. Show you one other Degas dance picture, just because this terrific picture, right? Where again, I just love that. I wish I could have made a composition like this, right? The format of the picture is not your standard Renaissance format, based on the golden rectangle. It's long and it's narrow. It's not a very big picture. It's only about 2 feet across or so, right? But this girl resting on a cello in between dance lessons. Again, it's called the dance lesson, but nobody's really dancing here. And there's that expanse of green and brown wall that just sort of shoots in from the left, right? That's really very flat. And then these figures that are sort of arranged almost loosely across the expanse of that floor that tips up. All showing, I think, very strongly the influence of Japanese art, right? So Degas is really fascinated with this stuff. Degas' other series of images of women at work are prostitutes. And like dancers who aren't dancing, who aren't performing, right? His prostitutes are also in between jobs, so to speak, right? And it's very different from what Manet gave us, right? Manet's Olympia, she's on the clock. You've brought her flowers. We know what happens next. Turns it R-rated, right? With Degas, it's cleaning yourself up to get ready to be presented to your client, rather than the actual presentation. In the same way that his dancing women are preparing to dance, rather than actually presenting their professional face to an audience, right? And like his dancers, there is this question of his outlook toward them. Is there some misogyny here? Because again, look at that extraordinarily ungainly position, right? There was a whole Seinfeld episode built around. Do you guys still watch Seinfeld? Am I too old for this now? Right? No, you don't? Or yes, you do? I'm not too old for this now. Okay, maybe next year. There's a whole episode where he broke up with a woman because he saw her in the bathtub bending over to pick up soap. And he just thought that was such a rotten view of her that he ended up breaking up with her. And he's talking to George, why'd you break up? Because, well, she was in the bath and she bent over. And it's like, that was it. And he was done, right? And there's something to be said about that. And Degas doesn't show them beautiful. He doesn't show them like Manet might, welcoming us. He shows them in these positions where the job has rendered them into something somewhat more attractive. And often, this makes it even more clear, he takes these points of view that look down on them, right? Where he has this viewpoint that gives him status over the top of them and looking down. And so here another of these images. This is up at the Krieger on Foxhall Road of her washing her hair, right? So Degas is very much interested in throughout his career. And by the way, hey, not quite, almost 20th century. We're almost there. But Degas very much interested in labor, right, in his works. Because, again, he saw himself as a realist, but there's a tight connection between the realist and the impressionist. He shows with the impressionists. Now, Degas was very good friends with this American painter named Mary Cassatt. Not lovers or anything, just good friends. Cassatt's family was from Philadelphia. The family had relocated for business reasons to Paris. She went with them, right? Family actually had Parisian roots, and so this is why they moved back. And she moved there as a young woman and was able to make a career there. In fact, was asked by Degas to join the group, right? With, I think, the second Impressionist exhibition. Degas said, hey, Mary, come and join us. Which itself is somewhat extraordinary because the Academy, right, the French Royal Academy, made it much more difficult for women artists, but the Impressionists were very much open arms. That was part of their rebellion, was to be egalitarian along gender lines, right? So on the left, I adore this picture. It's a picture of Cassatt seen from behind by Degas. Now, not seen from behind like our dancers bending over or anything like that, right? But they're visiting the Louvre. They've gone to the museum together. And based on that, he's not setting up his easel and painting her in the Louvre, right? But he's remembering that and painting this memorial. And the colors that you see exploding on the wall are meant to be paintings on the wall of the Louvre, right? And they visited the Louvre together. And they were, in fact, very, very good friends. Over in the Smithsonian American Museum is a painting of Cassatt by Degas, of her with postcards she's bought at the Louvre. It's a really charming picture, right? And they went out together often to look at art together, and they became very, very, very good friends. And Degas inspired her to join the Impressionists. And so with the picture on the right, I keep saying this, but it's true. This is also like, I think this is a fantastic picture. The little girl in the blue armchair. It's one of, I remember this picture from before I ever moved here. Like, I didn't even know it was here, right? It's just a fantastic picture of this girl in this sort of, it's almost not monochromatic, but you say diachromatic, two colors, right? The blue of the chairs and that sort of off monkey brown of the floor, right, is really all you've got. And that wonderful arrangement of the blue chairs and the extraordinary freedom of the paint that she uses to make the pattern of the upholstery on the chair. That looks almost abstract when we look at it more closely. And how the chairs, right, the two in the foreground and the two in the background, make this pattern so that you get this thing that almost looks like Texas or Africa that's cut out, right? The flatness of the floor here compared to the modeling of the chairs, which aren't really modeled all that much, right? But it's very hard to think of this as something other than a cutout shape. Because she's not really, it doesn't gradate in any way, right? It doesn't change color or tone as it moves to the background. Even as it gets closer to the window, there's not a whole lot of tonal change there. And we're picked up with that down below. It's almost like there's this jigsaw puzzle of big pieces that's sort of locked together in this room, to the point where our little girl in the foreground, it's almost like she can't go anywhere, right? The two chairs have sort of blocked her from even moving around that room. And there's something about her face that I think suggests that pent-up restlessness. If you take that pose, right, she's just like, this is a bad little girl, right? Mommy, right? She's not screaming, but she probably was, right, or will. Before this, she's been told to sit and be quiet, and she wants nothing of that, right? And the composition helps with that theme of her being sort of restless in her little. She's all dressed up as well, right? Those are not your everyday clothes. She has matching socks and sash, right? And the thing in her hair are all matching fabrics. So she's probably off to some birthday party or something and can't wait to go. And this is the moment before she leaves, right? Probably Degas introduced Cassatt to Japanese prints. You can't find a print of the same subject matter, but if we think about the way Hiroshige is organizing the sailboats and the islands as they move back into space, that seems loose, but at the same time deliberate and thoughtful against a fairly flat plane of color, right? Cassatt's sort of picking up on these hints and coming up with a sort of modern idea, right? Now, the theme that she's working with, right, which is this young girl, anxious in this interior, right? Anxious to leave this interior, to go somewhere. This is a theme that Cassatt works with a lot. And we think it has everything to do with her own experience as a painter in France, as a woman painter in France. So here, a friend of hers sitting at a window with a dog, looking out the window, again, all dressed up with nowhere to go. She has to wait to go outside. Even though she's not like a little girl, she looks like she's old enough to go do this herself. Each of them with a dog as a foil, right? And this brings us around to sort of what were opportunities for women in the 19th century. That helps to explain these pictures, right? This is an era called the Third Republic. And during the Third Republic, it was very difficult for women to go outside by themselves. Women had to be escorted when they went out. Otherwise, they ran the risk of being picked up, hit on, right? Because women that were outside by themselves, utterly by themselves, unaccompanied whatsoever by a child or a man, right, were prostitutes. And even the ones that weren't were seen to be, right? Working girls. So in both of these pictures, we have this sense of a woman's experience. Mary Cassatt, as an Impressionist painter, does not have the same opportunities that the men did. She can't go set up an easel outside and paint. Not without some difficulty, not without a chaperone, right? She can't go to the Louvre without Degas, right? She can't go study paintings. And her pictures show us this sense of what was a woman's experience in 19th century France. There's the city waiting for her on the left, right? The dog sees something pretty, squirrel, right? Down in the park or something. He's drawn a bead on something out there. He's interested in something outside as well. She's looking off wistfully there. The girl in the blue armchair, right? Stuck inside the house, nowhere to move, composition that locks her into a particular place, right? And restless, right? Waiting. This is Cassatt's experience, right? Look at that application of paint around her head. It's fantastic, right? This is her Mary Cassatt's experience. And the puppy dog, Restful, only accents that, right? This is what she's been told to do, and the dog is there to offset all of her restlessness, right? And again, there we can see this impressionist, what we call impressionist brushwork, right? This seemingly spontaneous application of paint. And I've always told the people who make art that all of your problems are solved if you go to the National Gallery. How do you paint a dog's fur? And you'll notice that she doesn't paint the dog on the blue chair. She comes back and paints the blue chair over the top of the dog just to cut off those areas of shadow and fur, right? There's no problem you have in the studio that you can't solve by looking at these things close up. Right? So our Impressionism shows us a range of things, right? From outdoor scenes to indoor scenes, from labor to leisure to work to a woman's experience inside the home. So the Impressionists is not just one group, right, or not just one way of painting, not just one thematic choice, but rather quite a big range. We'll look at how Impressionism develops into what we call post-Impressionism on Thursday. I have one more woman impressionist I want to show you, simply because we haven't seen that many women artists, and I hate to skip her. So depending on how I feel on Thursday, I'll try to bring her in as well and look at her works too. So we'll see you on Thursday, and again, be sure to check your email for my comments on your progress reports. Right?